Okay, Drishti here. Yeah, so I think it's 10:06, we can begin with the webinar now. So, very good morning to all. My name is Architect Tushar Mandal. I'm a teaching faculty at the Periyar School of Architecture, New Delhi. I welcome you all to the 34th webinar in the Every Friday webinar series, a platform for young minds to express their ideas. Today's webinar will be discussing space and time in Asian arts, presented by Ms. Drishti Desai. So, to introduce the speaker for today, Drishti is a researcher in art history with an MA from SOAS, University of London. Her research interests lie in the visual culture of Asia, focusing on politics and aesthetics of historical art. Prior to her MA, she graduated in filmmaking from Srishi Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. She scripted and directed the film Paneer Sevlan, which has been screened at multiple film festivals and won a special mention at the Cutting Film Festival at Flame University, Pune. Drishti has worked at the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai as a research associate and is currently based in Delhi, working in research, archive, and curation for an upcoming museum. I would request Drishti to now begin her presentation, and it's a request to all the participants to keep themselves muted for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box, or you could ask them at the end of the presentation when we open the floor for questions. Thank you. Drishti could begin.
Hi, Tushar, and hello everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here and giving me this opportunity to share my interests. Um, I'm an art historian, I guess. What an art historian usually does is looks at images, analyzes them, understands the history of the piece. So it's a scientific process in some sense, right? You're trying to fact check, you're trying to understand where it came from, when it came from, who used it, what the context was. But I have a background in creative art, and therefore this exercise today is going to be a creative exercise. I will not be focusing so much on the history or the facts of the image itself, but we'll be looking at this idea of narration, the idea of time, the idea of space within art. Sorry. We'll be looking at three different points of view in my presentation. The first one is visual composition. So you're looking at the art object itself and how it has been visually composed by the artist. What can you understand about space and time through simply looking at the image? The second is art experience. An art object doesn't exist in isolation. People come to view it, people sit around, people interact with it. There's a certain experience or a transfer of, say, emotions or feelings between the art object and the person who actually ends up seeing the piece. And the third that we're going to be looking at is the philosophy of time in a lot of Asian cultures, time and space both, and how they interact with each other. My interests are across the spectrum, so we're not going to be limited to time or space in the kind of images I'm showing. It's going to be a mix of Indian art, Asian art, classical paintings, sculptures across all mediums. This is an image of the Buddha from Afghanistan. I wanted to begin with this idea of a portrait or a human figure or a human head. What is most recognizable to about any interaction of somebody you meet is usually the face. We have this idea that the face is the visual symbol for the entire body or the person or the self itself. A lot of people throughout the history of art have created images of faces, of portraits, self-portraits. And what is it, I question, is the drive behind trying to create something like this, right? There's this idea of immortalizing oneself in a sense of trying to fight against time in any act of art making. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. In that story, the basic idea is also that a young, good-looking man wants to make sure that he remains that throughout history. throughout, even as time passes, in some sense fighting against the ravages of time. And this idea of beauty is very interesting because you have immortalized something, but it also looks aesthetically pleasing. It's not an ugly head of the Buddha, for example, that you're looking at. And in a sense, there is this tension of humans trying to fight against this ravage of nature. But when you look at an image like this, one would simply assume that it is a single image of a portrait. I'm guessing, you're not looking at the idea of there being, say, a narrative in this, or there being a long story, or any sense of time in this. But then you look closer and you see that broken part over the head. You see how the paint has come off a little bit around the eyes. The entire piece has been taken off from somewhere else and is currently in a museum. And just looking at this image, you can see traces of time in some sense. This is another visual from the Sanchi archaeological site. And this is the image of a Yakshi figure. They are fertility goddesses in Buddhism, early Buddhism. Looking at this image, you see, what do you see? You see a woman, very scantily clothed, hanging off the branch of a tree with fruits and plants hanging off of it. At first glance, this doesn't look like a visual narrative. It looks like the image of a woman hanging off a tree. And then you search for slight signs of time. One is the object itself. So the stone has come off in a few places. Her nose is kind of gone off. And you also see the idea of the fruits that are hanging off of it. The growth of a tree and the idea of fertility happens over time. So when you're looking at, say, her enlarged breasts, a lot of Yakshi figures were considered symbols of fertility and also associated with childbearing. So you're looking at a woman who is currently perhaps not with child, but definitely has the possibility of childbirth, and therefore you see in the possible future an idea of time. This is a landscape painting. At first glance, once more, it is the image of a waterfall off of a high mountainscape and a building on the side. It's a single image, not much conception of time or space. It's beautifully crafted with ink, painted. And you're looking at a similar landscape when you compare the previous image with this relief work from Sanchi. It is once again with the presence of human figures in a landscape space. You see trees, you see a river here, but you see a lot of human figures, you see animals here. And therefore you think that comparing this image with this one, perhaps this has some kind of narrative. So the moment there's a human placed in a space, there is this idea or possibility of action, and that kind of action or leads to this idea of there perhaps being movement, and movement only exists in time. So this is it's a narrative piece of the Mahakapi Jataka from the Buddhist Jataka tales. And it's very interesting how there is a geographical limitation on just one space, but an entire narrative is occurring within the space. On the bottom left, you see the tale goes like this, that there was once a tree which had a lot of rich fruit. And this was well renowned. This was a hidden place where a lot of monkeys used to live with the king, the Mahakapi, which is an incarnation of the Buddha. At some point, this was discovered by a hunter who goes to inform the king of this tree. And the king arrives with a whole retinue of his men because he wants to get all the fruits from the tree. In order to do that, they have to get rid of all the monkeys who are already living there, for whom the tree is the home. So here on the left, you see the king on the horse with a canopy over the head. His army of men are below him, and there's a hunter. The moment the monkeys hear that these people have come to take over our home, they try to run off. The main king, who is the incarnation of the Buddha, he helps all of his monkey subjects cross the river by hanging off of the tree that you see on the top of the image. Is the monkey extended across two banks of the river, and that is the main Buddha figure. And then you see the hunter who is aiming his bow at that monkey in order to stop them from escaping, almost in the center of the image. So there's an entire narrative that has been placed within a landscape image. So there's a sense of time, there's a sense of movement, but simultaneously you can see it as a single image and realize that, oh, this is the Jataka. Similarly, in terms of composition, when you're looking at, this is a print, a Japanese print by Otagawa Hiroshige. And there is this idea of the foreground and the background. But here, instead of the foreground having any human figures or any kind of action, the foreground is a tree in bloom. But it's again a still image. You wouldn't expect this to have any sort of movement or any kind of narrative, therefore. So the question would be, would a tree therefore be an interesting subject for a story? In the background, you see a lot of people who are visiting the shrine in Japan. It's a popular site, and what becomes interesting is there is the foreground, there is the sense of scale and space from the foreground until the background, which is in the center of the image. But you also have a lot of these trees that are branching off into the distance. The illusion becomes interesting because the trees can also be seen as branches off of the main trunk in the front of it. So it's almost like a fractal image. If you didn't have any of the humans in the background, if you didn't have a sense of, say, blue color in the bottom and red at the top, and you were just to take out the images of the trees, it would look like one single tree that has a lot of branches coming off of it. So by simply placing a line of human figures in the center, there is suddenly a sense of time and space that you have created. Similarly, in this composition, this is a miniature painting by Abhinavnath Tagore. And this is the King Shah Jahan in his final days before his death. He's gazing off into the distance towards the Taj Mahal that he built for his wife. There is a sense of, like I mentioned in the beginning, you have this idea of ravages of time. You're trying to immortalize oneself. And especially at this moment where he's about to encounter death, he's looking back in memory to a certain kind of past or some this sense of romantic creation that he's built for his wife, and which is also in itself, the Taj Mahal in itself is a symbol of, say, love being able to persist over time. That is how we understand it today. And at this very crucial moment, you see two different frames. One is the foreground, where you have all the pillars and Shah Jahan himself seated with his daughter. And the background has been interestingly placed between two of the pillars, which is therefore almost like a niche. So you're looking through the pillars in order to look at that. So the Taj Mahal, in that sense, can be placed within this landscape in the same space as Shah Jahan currently. But at the same time, this Taj Mahal visual that you see, which is cut off visually with that arch frame in there, is also existing in a time in the past that Shah Jahan is looking back towards. So the old Shah Jahan currently is old, approaching death. But the Taj Mahal is in that sense timeless. So it's unbound by time simply by framing it in that visual space. This is a traditional miniature painting. It is Maharana Amar Singh hunting wild boars, which was a very popular imagery in a lot of the Rajasthani paintings. And there is a lot at work here once again. Again, the human versus nature aspect is very interesting because this is a royal figure who's trying to establish, in a sense, his authority or his skill at being able to conquer nature. Wild boars were considered to be extremely, I mean, quite dangerous. So this act of killing an animal, therefore, and painting it in order to present to the subjects is an act of glorifying of the king taking over nature. And the fact that it's been painted visually is again in order to memorialize him in some sense. This is a single image, again, geographically within one single landscape, as you can see. If you were to remove all the humans, this would look like the photograph of a landscape in some sense. The moment the people are placed, there is a sense of time within the narrative, which in some sense can go like this. You have a landscape. Some of the servants are trying to guide the boar across the river. The king enters into the frame and he's hunting these boars. A lot of them have been killed. And at the very bottom, after the hunt, a lot of people are awaiting the king to sit back on this and move away. What becomes interesting also is how the river has been presented here. The first is it's quite flat. In the second, there is a sense of movement that is going across the frame. So there's a lot of drama, a lot of action taking place here. This is the central space for the king to assert himself, which is the high or the crescendo of the narrative. And in the bottom, the river again flows smoothly. So the story has in some sense come to an end. So one single image can encompass a lot of different aspects or a lot of different ways of viewing it. This, however, has been linear. Our movement across the frame has gone from the top to the bottom in terms of time, for example. If you look at an image like this, again, another hunting scene of hunting cranes this time. There is no sense of hierarchy, of anything being larger than something else. All of the figures are roughly in the same size. The only thing that is even throughout is, again, the idea of landscape and a lot of topography in some sense. So there a lot of early paintings did not depict time in chronological order. It was not limited to a certain linearity. And especially in this space, you can see that time or a narrative has been presented geographically. Movement doesn't happen based on time. Movement exists simultaneously across the frame, and a lot of different actions are happening at the same time. So the king, for example, you can see in the center on a horse, on a white horse, and that same king is present somewhere around the left on the horse once more. You can see the fan held by the bearer, the round black fan. And once more, the king is present multiple times within the same frame throughout. This is, in some sense, looking at, therefore, memorializing a narrative, not through facts. The artist does not want to convey how the story went or when it went. The artist, in this sense, is prioritizing a lot of actions happening in a certain kind of geographical space that is very varied. So what comes forth the most here is the fact that the king has traveled across all of these spaces and he has interacted with a lot of these things through the course of hunting for cranes. And in this sense, this is therefore why I was saying how art history tends to be very factual in some sense. You're looking at history as facts. Whereas which is ironic, because when you look at the content of a lot of this art, the content does not focus on the narrative. It does not focus on what happened when, at before what time, after what time, who did what, but rather it's trying to say create an emotion, or trying to prioritize a certain kind of action, or present a certain version of an idealized, I suppose, visual of somebody. Aristotle in his Poetics also mentions how poetry, for example, is better than history, particularly because poetry is trying to present what ought to be or what can be rather than what actually is. So imitation of a certain reality that you see, therefore, is not as important. This takes us to, say, a viewer's experience. When you're looking at any piece of art, when I showed you this image before, the landscape image, it came to you as a single visual. Whereas if you look at it now in terms of, say, a scroll, in terms of movement, looking at that single line of the waterfall, if you just focus on that line, you realize how long it goes on and on and on. And just that idea of length, that idea of height, the scale of the mountain has been presented simply by how narrow and how thin the waterfall has been presented to be as. So the moment you look at this visual in that sense, there is again time and the water actually falling down from the very top down to the very bottom here. Therefore, the idea of memory becomes very interesting, because, say, when you actually go to visit a waterfall, what is it that you remember? Do you actually, if you were present, place yourself in the space, would you remember the water actually falling from the top to the bottom and see the flow? Or would you perhaps remember the people that you went with, and what they ended up doing? Or perhaps there was a mishap and somebody fell down. So what are these incidents that you end up remembering becomes very interesting. There is landscape paintings in that sense are a memory rather than actual real imitations. A lot of these Chinese landscape paintings are depicting nature in an idealized form in some sense, and incredibly beautifully rendered. You can see the scale of the mountain here. There is movement, but also there is stillness. There is the weight of the mountains. There's a lot of mist moving about, which is in some sense creating this to be a sort of dream space, rather than, say, if you were to take a photograph of this, if you went to these mountains and took a picture, it would look completely different from something like this. And the moment you see these mists, the moment you see a little bit of depth, but also some things are hidden, some things are visible. Water has been rendered purely through negative space. It has not been painted on. The only thing that has been painted on are things that are heavy, things that have color, that have depth. And therefore, this is you're looking at the space, you are in the space, but it is also the memory of somebody else having been in that space. The artist who must have visited the site, sketched it maybe, and returned back to create the final image, for example. And on returning back, it would have, in some sense, captured the essence of his experience rather than a likeness or an exact imitation of what he saw. There is the memory of that. And then there is the memory of when I present this to you all today. Say 10 days later, you remember this image. What is it about this that you're going to remember? So time moves in a lot of different ways, and a lot of this is non-linear. A lot of this is interconnected to other ideas that are not easily apparent to us immediately. When you're looking at, this is another landscape painting once more, but here this has been presented with human figures at the bottom, and trying to again present a royal image of a king in the landscape space. This is again, therefore, the moment a royal patronage is present, it is an advertisement of sorts, right? This king wants to show that even so many years later on, this is where I went, this is what I did. But what becomes interesting in a lot of these Chinese compositions also is that the human is always a part of the landscape. The landscape is still the most important thing. The mountain takes up most of the space in the image. And interacting in this space in itself is a certain kind of honor. This has a lot of influence from another Chinese philosophy. And in that, you're looking at the mountain itself, nature itself being larger than life, or the driving force of life. Instead of, say, worshipping a certain kind of god, you're looking at the might of the mountains as being the inspiration for the life force. If you move back to, say, the Indian context of Krishna, who is another like god figure that we tend to revere, what is it about Krishna that we remember, for example? This is one of his most famous stories, Krishna dancing over Kalya. Kalya was said to be a poisonous snake, Naga, who had taken over this section of the river where no animals could survive, no fishes could live, no plants around the banks could survive. And so Krishna comes over, he has a really violent battle with him, and he emerges on top having subdued this snake. The moment the snake is subdued, in this visual, you see Krishna framed at the center. There is the difference between the top being land and the bottom being the river, water. There's a lot of Naga figures, female figures, who are revering Krishna. Now that he has taken over Kalya, everybody is grateful for him. There's human figures, there's snakes. So this is traversing this human animal space. It is traversing the space of, say, land and water. It is also interesting with the idea of music, for example, that you see on the left with all the musicians and Krishna himself holding the flute. And Krishna is therefore in multiple spaces at once. He is both of the human realm, but he is also, say, conquered animals, but he's also a divine figure. And that becomes very interesting when you then look at this composition of Krishna, where you're moving back in time and you're looking at him in the act of fighting the snake. So the artist here has memorialized this act of might or valor to be more important, whereas here Krishna having conquered and therefore playing music is important. You can see all the figures on the right, top right, the people of his village who are all, shouting or worried for him, who are wondering how this battle is going to go. Some of the female Naginis are trying to help Krishna. And his foot has taken over the head of this multi-headed snake. The whole imagery is in some sense topsy-turvy. There is the river has been presented in the circular form. So it's almost like there's a lot of turbulence, there's a lot of movement going on. The earth is not flat, it's rounded again once more. And it presents a certain kind of mood of this drama, of this action that is taking place, which is very dynamic. And if you were to think of, say, both of these artists who have painted the previous image and this one, in some sense, it is their memory of hearing these stories growing up of how Krishna took over over Kalya, and what each of them has remembered from memory of these scenes is what they have then therefore presented to viewers. This is another scene of Krishna fighting the demon horse Keshi. This is a small fragment once more. You can see the horse on the right and the horse again present at the bottom. The head has been broken off, but the legs are put up, and you can see three pieces of dung right above it, which is what he probably pooped out before, like at the moment of death. Krishna's expression is violent, it is assertive. He's in the act of fighting against this. It looks painful with the teeth biting against his arm, but he is still he is come out victorious at the end of it. A single visual once more is presenting a narrative of Krishna. And if we therefore look at what stories of Krishna you remember from your childhood, for example, this is only an example. Of course, across all religions and cultures, there are different narratives that you've grown up listening to. And therefore, what narrative or what single image for you stands out of all of those? In that sense, the lifetime of Krishna is not as important in its hierarchy. There is no sense of at what age, where he was, and what he did, but rather the fact that these have been his heroic scenes, and this is what shall be remembered. Time, therefore, does not function once more linearly, and this is an aspect of myth making in some sense. Krishna, we assume today, is a mythological figure. And myth, in that sense, is a pastiche. It has been built up over time. Some stories of Krishna emerged much later on, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when they occurred, and it doesn't matter at what point in Krishna's life they occurred. All it matters is that it presents a certain facet of his personality, or a certain kind of value that you associate with him. That becomes important. In that same sense, when you're looking at the Ajanta cave paintings, when you enter a cave, I don't know how many of you have been there, but when you enter a cave, a lot of the Jatakas, a lot of stories from the Buddha's lives have been painted over across the walls in terms of a narrative. So there is a clear sense of lots of different actions taking place within the story. And a lot of stories have been placed one above another, one below. There is no linearity in terms of moving across that entire space in terms of time. Whereas if you were to compare it to a museum experience today, a lot of museums tend to focus on their galleries in terms of a chronological time. So this is what came first, this is what came second. So in some sense, we're trying to make sense of what happened. But if you take the example of these cave paintings, it is not important when these things happened, but it is important that these things happened and that they have been presented in a certain way. The visual, therefore, takes on a lot more importance. And the emotion or the feeling of that multiplicity of a lot of things happening becomes a lot more important than at what time they happened. This is a photograph taken in 2019. Landscapes, in that sense, have always fascinated humans. We are driven by things that are beyond us, that are larger than life to us. And so there's a lot of fascination with that in terms of presenting something that has, in some sense, stood the test of time. People will come and go, but this mountain will remain. And looking at a lot of these, going back to the Chinese landscape paintings, there is a monumentality, a scale to these mountains that is beyond, say, human conception. And that scale also, in some sense, is an immortalizing of the visual, but there is also an idealizing that the moment I place myself next to the scale, I will also become somehow similar to it. So I will imbibe that same sense of immortality. So again, moving back to this image of the king in that space, he is comparing himself to the mountain as being beyond time. This Jataka, for example, has been presented in a lot of different formats. And Mahakapi, the monkey itself, is only one incarnation or one life of the Buddha. The Buddha had over 500 different lives that were presented. Whether these were historical facts, one does not know. We don't know if he actually died, had a rebirth in another animal form, died, had a rebirth in another elephant form, for example. But the fact that the human imagination exists to create something like this, and the fact that the reason people have continued to believe these jatakas or stories adds value to it. And that in itself gives it meaning rather than it being historical fact. This is an image, another monumental image of the Buddha. This was when it was found in the ruins. If you zoom in, like if you go in a little closer, if you notice, there are two main pillars in the center in white. And right next to the second one, there is a slight human figure with his hands folded and praying towards the Buddha. This becomes interesting. We've heard a lot of stories like this, especially in Indian museums, for example. You place the image of a god and you see people worshipping it. At CSMVS, where I was working, there were 3 large images of, I think there was a Vishnu in the center. And every Monday morning, there would be a little Aarti Puja of that image. It is a museum object, but at the same time being worshipped by people. Context therefore becomes very important in art experience. When you're seeing this in its space where it was created versus where you move it out of the museum, the experience, say in an Indian museum of a Hindu god, would be different than a Hindu god in, say, the British Museum in London. That context layers in some sense your experience of the art, and it presents something different from what was. So the same object can be seen in a lot of different ways across time by the same person. Every moment of encounter with the object will create a different experience. This leads us in some sense to the final section of the philosophy of time. This is Shiva Nataraj. A lot of Hindu conception of time is cyclical. And in that sense, the Nataraj image with the circle around in the back, the circle of flames, is the circle of the cosmos, fire, which gives birth to light, which gives birth to energy, and which creates the universe. And so Shiva in this Shiva Nataraj image comes across as a single visual image, but the symbolism behind it encompasses all different aspects of time, which are creation, sustenance, and destruction. This cyclical nature of time has been presented in a lot of Hindu, Buddhist philosophies as well. And Shiva, in that sense, has been presented in a lot of narratives where he comes across as the victor in some sense. This pillar of fire, this is the story of the Lingodbhava, where Vishnu on the right and Brahma on the left, both of them had a fight once on who was more powerful or who created the universe. And Shiva emerges in this pillar of light with no end to the top or the bottom of it. And he asks both of them to look for either the beginning or the end. And neither of the gods could find it. When you're looking, therefore, at the visual of a pillar, it of course in the human space has a beginning and an end. In terms of architecture, for example, you've created it with a certain foundation. It is giving support to something else on top of it. But this idea of length becomes interesting when you're moving upwards towards a certain kind of truth in a lot of philosophical depictions. Moving upwards is also a visual for, say you have the idea of heaven or hell, right? So you're moving towards heaven, always seems to be above, hell always seems to be down. Heaven is always associated with light, hell is associated with darkness. And I will end this with this idea of darkness that becomes very interesting. Is Kala is the word for time, and Kala is also the word for black or darkness. And that darkness is, in a lot of philosophy, all phenomena that is dark, which everything remains dark until there is light. And this darkness is also what you experience when there is no light left in your eyes at the moment of death. The moment of death, therefore, in some sense, is the end of time for the human experience. But that same darkness is also the darkness of the universe. And that universe is beyond human time. So Kala, therefore, also means infinite time, but there is a version of Kala which is Kalika, which means belonging to time, and therefore there being limited amount of time, which is the human experience. The Kali, therefore, being associated with death and also being dark, becomes very interesting. Here she is over Shiva. She is defeated Shiva in some sense. And this destroying is the end of that cycle of time, towards the end where destruction happens and which allows you to give birth to a new creation. Yeah, I think that's about it. I hope this led to some questions or some ideas of looking at the world a little differently than how we've been used to seeing so far. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Drishti, for the wonderful presentation. It was just quite thought-provoking. So yeah, we've opened the floor for questions now. If there's any participant who would want to ask any question, they can either unmute themselves and ask, or they can just put it in the chat box, whichever you're more comfortable. At the same time, I think I would also like to welcome Professor Shailesh Srivastav. She is a professor from the Vastukala Academy. Welcome, ma'am, to the webinar. So yeah, if there's any,
thanks so much.
ma'am, if you have any comments or any views or questions, then please feel free to
No,
ask
I'm
for it.
amazed at her study so much. She has, I was just listening and deep insights about all the dimensions of time and space. It was very enlightening for me.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So yeah, if there's any question, then any participant wants to ask, they can either put it in the chat box or they can.
Yeah, sure. I'd
just
love to ask a question.
yes, please, could you just introduce yourself once and then you can ask.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nihal. I'm not too directly related with art. I was at one time, but not anymore. Super illuminating talk. So, Drishti, my question is, as an art historian with a background in both research and design thinking for you, what do you gravitate towards more? Is it fact versus interpretation? Because you kind of spoke about both, between what is and what remains to be seen or said. I'd like to know your personal take on it. Thanks.
I think it was pretty evident through the presentation that I am more interested in interpretation than fact. But at the same time, so there is this idea of in the conception, in the philosophy of the mundane world, which is the world that we interact with and live in, and there is the transcendent world that you achieve after enlightenment or where you've achieved such a state of wisdom and consciousness that in Buddhism, for example, you can't suffer anymore. You're beyond these limitations that of the mundane world in some sense. And a lot of these philosophies do not disregard the mundane world. The way we interact today, the fact that this table is a table, the fact that I am talking to you through a laptop, these are realities that you can't ignore. So in a lot of that sense, fact does give way. I mean, it is necessary in order to understand, to have a certain foundation. But it is important also to realize that fact does not lead to truth, or fact is not always truth. And those are certain limitations of like being human, I suppose. And I think what one can work towards is, like, as all art does, is create something beyond your imagination, but also create something that can move you, that can lead you to a certain experience. And any kind of, say, interpretation, therefore, is, my presentation today was a creative endeavor, because I'm trying to present something that I think I believe in, or something that I find interesting. And I think that has value for us as humans, I guess. Sorry, that was a bit philosophical.
I think that itself answered my question. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nihal, for the wonderful question. Thank you, Drishti, for the answer. So yeah, if there's any other participant, then please feel free to either you can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat box. In the meantime, I think, Drishti, I'll go ahead with my question. So throughout the presentation, one thing I noticed, like the common, if I can just try and pick at the common theme of the presentation, it would probably be contrast, because we got contrast between, for example, in the beginning, it was between temporality and permanence. Then we got contrast between two kinds of scale to the Shah Jahan painting. We got the contrast between static and dynamic movement in the painting, linearity, non-linearity of time, facts versus memories. And at the very end, you explained about the different kinds of time that are depicted, right? Like the immortal versus the mortal. Immortal being the full amount of time, or the immortal time, and the mortal being the small amount of time that is given to humans for the experience. So if we look at it in that way, if within this, for example, these checklist, I see two very static contrasts. Like in the beginning, we have permanence versus temporality, right? And at the very end, we have the immortality of time versus the mortal experience. So in this case, how would you, or what would be your views on just comparing those two aspects within itself? That on one hand, we are talking about time itself being immortal, but at the same time, we're also talking about humans trying to emulate that within the limited time frame they have. They try to, or we try to immortalize ourselves within the small amount of time given to us. So it's, in a way, if you see, it's a dichotomy, right? It's a contrasting viewpoint of how we as humans experience time, but at the same time, how we as humans want to leave behind ourselves, or a legacy for ourselves. So if you could just give your views on that.
I think so. There's this idea of the macrocosm and the microcosm, right?
Yeah.
Or you have, say, a map of the entire world, and then you have yourself living in that space. I think both exist simultaneously, but it's also important to recognize that we are creating this difference in order to understand for ourselves. It's a very human act to create this duality, to compare two things in order to understand the differences between the two. But at the same time, say you take the example of the map, you can have the map zoomed out to the universe, you can have the map zoomed out to the galaxy, you can have map zoomed out to Earth, state, country, nation, down to the to an ant, right? So in order to make sense for ourselves, we use these two dualities, but actually there are multiplicities that exist. There are multiple different ways in which you can experience things. And that, I think, is beyond humanness in some sense, which is why we get so caught up in, say, our own lives sometimes, because you think that is your only reality. So creating a difference or realizing, I always tend to do this. I look up at the stars when I'm feeling like very overwhelmed with things. And so that creates a sense of scale, which helps you come to terms with existence, the human
Okay.
existence. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, if wait, let me first ask if there's any other question that somebody wants to ask, or else I'll have a follow for this. So yeah, if there's any question, then please you can go ahead and ask your question. So Drishti, there's a question in the chat box from Raswan. Uh, if you could just.
Yeah. So Rizwan's asking how art influences architecture on a monumental scale and also on a human scale. Uh, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by art influencing architecture. And architecture is something you are better informed. It's not my area of expertise. But if you were to simply look at the experience of architecture on a monumental or on a human scale, a lot of, say, Western architectural styles tend to look at height as being really important. You look at colonial structures, and there are these massive pillars, and the ceilings are really tall. That is aspirational in some sense. There is a sense of wanting to be as grand as that, and I suppose, like, the moment you place any human in a built environment, um, the the context changes from human to human in terms of experience. Um, Rizwan, can you, I don't know, explain a little more what you mean by art influencing architecture? If you can get on call or text.
Rizwan, if you could maybe just unmute yourself and ask, or just put it in.
May I actually what is
Yes, ma'am, please.
Rizwan answering that? Is Rizwan answering that?
He might be putting in the chat box, or ma'am, in the meantime, you can
I
go
was
ahead.
trying to understand his question, so trying to help Drishti out here.
Right.
As architects, there are lots of technicalities that we are dealing with when creating an architectural design. So perhaps Rizwan is trying to find the place of art in all that. That
Right. Okay.
at one point you are very objective. Okay, structure of the building, the construction materials, and all those nitty-gritties, and then trying to kind of marry art with all that technical stuff. Perhaps
Right.
I'm think that he might be meaning that.
Right. In terms of so there are lots of different ways of looking at this. In terms of again, this is my personal opinion. In terms of Buddhist philosophy, for example, there is a moral code or a certain way of interacting with people. It's quite not rigid, but there are certain ideals laid out on how a human must behave or how not to behave, and a lot of that is focusing on inculcating a certain value system. Um, Say something as tiny as not killing or taking life of something else, and a lot of these values exist in, say, the mundane world that we interact in day to day. Inculcating these values is a philosophical method of moving into it, and a lot of Buddhist art is presenting that philosophy through the art. um, but at the same time, there is irony, I suppose. There's hypocrisy, uh, because Buddhism, for example, would not have flourished without the amount of money that the merchants or the kings patronized and gave to them. We would not be talking about Buddhism today if it were not for, say, wars that gave way to kingdoms being built. Take Ashoka as an example. Um, and in that same sense, in architecture, I suppose it's that space where you are you have this vision, you have this idea of or creating something larger than life, beyond imagination, but you are driven down to the limitations of what is practical. I would add that in say the Buddhist sense, there should also be the idea of what is ethical, therefore, in terms of something as simple as, say, green building, or uh, taking down buildings in order to build affordable housing to a lot of people. Um, a lot of these practices traverse the space of there are real life implications, there are real life causalities, interconnectedness. The material comes from a certain place, the labor comes from a certain place. And making it happen in this, with these limitations in some sense, but I think they could also lend you to a certain, say, visual language, or lend you to a certain method of creating. I don't know to what extent this is, say, even like necessary for an architect to, say, be ethical or not. That comes down to everybody's individual preferences or everybody's different compasses in life. But this is just like something else to, I don't know, add to the conversation, I guess.
Yeah, I think you very rightly pinpointed about the support art needs, because particularly in Indian context, where we are saying we are no developing country and less developed. Again, development is also very debatable. Is
Yeah.
economic advancement development, or what, having material possessions? But
Exactly, yeah.
when you talk about ethics, I think that is one thing that can take us forward when you have dilemmas like that, what to choose. So, and probably the art will find the right place by sticking to your ethics, your compasses. Maybe it will not be so much of a question.
But that also, I suppose, it also develops over time, right? What I would create when I was 20 years
absolutely.
old would be different from what I would create at 65.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Hi, Drishti.
Hi,
Hello.
Rizwan.
Hi. Thanks, Shelly, for elaborating my point. And my question was almost in the line of what Shelly explained. As an architect, actually, we think about the function of the element more than the aesthetics of the element. So my question was originating from the fact that you showed some architectural elements as artifacts in the very beginning. So is there any divide in between that particular frame of mind? You're looking at a object or a thing as an art piece or as an architectural element itself. So yeah, that was my question.
Right. I have not studied architecture very much. So what you are saying is something I should actually probably work on next. I have not, so far I've always been looking at architectural depictions as depictions, only as art, not as architectural structures. So this is definitely like another lens to look at or interpret this piece of work. Thank you.
So just to add to the point, I think, or to this whole conversation, I think it also goes the other way around, because when we talk about architecture, or particularly any design, we talk about it in terms of the creator's experience or the creator's intent, right? But at the same time, just like any piece of art, there's always the user's experience that needs to be taken into consideration,
Right.
because it's not just about the person living in the building or the person using the building, but also at the same time, any neighborhood or any neighboring person or anybody even remotely passing by that particular building has a certain experience related to that building. So I think it also goes the other way around, in that just like how we look at art through the lens of time and user experience and memory, versus not just having cold hard facts, something that you mentioned in the presentation, that also should go forward to, let's say, architecture as an exercise itself. So yeah, thank you, Shaili ma'am, and thank you, Rizwan, for the question.
Mr. Mandal, this is Sangeeta here. before
Yes,
you
ma'am.
end the session. I think what Rizwan was talking, I'm not too much connected to either art or architecture, but I'll just give you one example as to, I'm based in Madurai, and we have this massive Meenakshi temple here. So usually when it's an architectural beauty, so when you visit the temple, from the architectural point of view, it's a beautiful piece which people would just come. For those who are into religious, they would see it from a religious point of view. But otherwise, it's an architectural wonder. So, but once that you get a little in-depth knowledge about art, I think you start seeing that particular place where few would take it as a religious place, few would take it as a architectural wonder, but few other people would see it as art, archived art where it takes backs you to time. So I think when the architects talk about creating something, I think this is something that you look into, that you create a piece which can combine the architectural wonder, what you can do with it, with the limited things given to you, the materials or, whatever. At the same time, incorporate art in such a way that it can be admired. So that's all that I wanted to add. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. All the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your. So yeah, I think we can take one last comment or question if there's anybody, and I think after that we can bring the webinar to a close. So if there's any last question or comment that somebody wants to just add in, then please feel free to go ahead. In the meantime, Drishti, I would ask you to check the chat box. There's some insightful points for your presentation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
do we have any last comment or question? Okay, so if not, I think with this we can bring the webinar to a close. I thank all the participants, and I particularly thank Drishti for a very thought-provoking presentation. We do definitely look forward to having you back on the platform, maybe with more insightful lectures. Thank you. So before closing, I would like to inform everyone about the Every Friday webinar series that's been organized by the Peria School of Architecture. So the webinars are a platform for young professionals to express their ideas and are aimed at students and young architects. We will also be running short-term courses in summer schools, and the information will soon be available on our website. With this, I would like to bring the webinar to a close. Have a good day, everyone, and thank you for taking your time for us today.
Thank you.